Hey students, it's Mr. Ramage, and today's lesson is going to take a look at some economic systems of the Industrial Revolution. We're going to primarily focus on capitalism and then take a look at socialism and eventually communism. Now, this is not going to be a super detailed lesson on any of these economic systems, as they're pretty complex, but we're going to try to explain how they apply to what we've learned and what's going to be coming up in the future as the Industrial Revolution expands around the world and brings about lots and lots and lots of change. So we have been talking a lot about industrialization going back to England in the mid-1700s, and industrialization and that revolution is going to spread to lots of different places around the world, and it's going to bring tremendous amounts of benefits. So again, we're going from a world where we're moving from people-powered machines to machine-powered machines. We've got the steam engine. We've got electricity now. We're seeing the growth of factories and urban cities and urbanization and mass production of goods on a very, very large scale. We're seeing revolutions in transportation with the steam engine being used to develop the locomotive and the railroad and the steamboat. And also the benefits to society, creating consumer goods that are available to all people at reasonable prices and creating new wealth and a new class of people in the growing middle class of the Industrial Revolution. So there's tremendous amounts of change, not just business-wise, but also in society as well. Lots and lots and lots of tremendous change, but also with these changes and all of this growth is going to come a lot of problems as well, from the terrible working conditions to the child labor of many industries employing children, to the terrible living conditions that the working class people are going to have to live in and suffer, and of course to the growing amount of pollution from the burning of coal in steam engines and the pollution of the air and the water and the destruction of natural resources in the name of progress. So the Industrial Revolution gives us a tremendous amount of advantages and a tremendous amount of change, but it also contributes to a lot of real suffering for people and a lot of real terrible things. So what factors are contributing to this? Why is this world starting to look really kind of unbalanced? And it's going to go back to one of our Enlightenment thinkers and writers from 1776, and his name was Adam Smith. And we mentioned him just in passing in Unit 1 in our study on the Enlightenment. Now we're going to get into a little bit more about his philosophy. And in 1776, Adam Smith published his most famous work called The Wealth of Nations. And this becomes sort of the handbook for capitalism. And in the book, to basically summarize his economic theory of capitalism, he says that self-interest benefits all. So that people do what's in their best interest will eventually benefit everybody. Well, let's take a little bit closer look, a very basic look at his economic theories. So he believed in a free market capitalist system where anybody was free to start their own business, develop their own business, make their own products, sell their own products, where you could work for whoever you wanted to and obtain the kind of wage you wanted and whatever, right? So a free market system based on supply and demand. If there was a demand for your product or a product, people would supply that product to meet that demand. It was also a system based on competition. So there were multiple companies producing multiple goods, and competition was good for everybody because competition would keep the price down and would not allow one business or one business to dominate one industry. A system where people have choices, where you can choose different types of products to purchase. You don't have to go to one company for one good. You can go to multiple companies for the same good. In a system based on private property, private ownership, that you could own your own company. It was safe from interference. You can make your own decisions, and you were the person in control. Now, that all sounds pretty awesome, right? And it should sound somewhat familiar. America is mostly a capitalist society. But Adam Smith also said that there were some things that should not happen in this free market system, emphasis on the word free, in terms of the role of the government, that the government should be hands-off. They should be laissez-faire, to use the French term, and that the government would not and should not and could not regulate this system because therefore it would no longer be a free market capitalist system. So governments should not get involved. Governments should be hands-off. And Smith said that we don't really need governments to be involved because there would be an invisible hand that businesses, even if they did bad things, even if they did wrong things over the course of time, the invisible hand would come in and would solve those problems. So if there was a company that was selling something that made people sick, at some point people are going to realize that's what's happening and will stop buying that product, and that business will go out of business, or they will change their product and make it no longer deadly to people, right? So that would be the invisible hands coming in and fixing everything. We don't need the government to do that for us. The system will fix itself. Well, that sounds great and that sounds good, but we can't always count on the invisible hand to come when we need it to. So if we look at free market system as described and supported by Adam Smith, there obviously are tons of positives. The Industrial Revolution was able to grow as quickly as it did and to advance as quickly as it did because of those characteristics and qualities. So on the positive side, we've got vast amounts of wealth that are being created in this system. We're developing new technologies almost daily that are changing and transforming the way that we live. We're creating millions of jobs for people to have, and we're creating economic and social growth like we've never seen before. So there is a tremendous upside to this system and a tremendous upside to this Industrial Revolution. But we have to also consider the negatives, right? So the negatives, and we've talked about these in class and we've looked at them, we have some really horrible, terrible working conditions because business owners were all about maximizing profit and were not investing in their factories, making them safe. They worked their factory workers as many hours as they could and paid them as low wages as they could. We have child labor is a huge problem in the Industrial Revolution, as children have to go to work in order to support their families, to make enough money to provide for them. The terrible living conditions in the cities and the tenement buildings, and the lack of sewage and the lack of proper sanitation and water, clean water, and the pollution and the corruption that's taking place in these cities. This is all happening because the governments just aren't involved and aren't really interested in regulating these systems. So Adam Smith's free market capitalist system provides lots of benefits, but also we have to take into account all the negatives that it creates as well. And under this free market capitalist system, we begin to see a new social system developing in these industrialized countries, where now it's not the landowner anymore or the nobility anymore that's at the top of the social ladder. It's rather the business owners who are profiting greatly from this massive industrialization. And it's a small group of people at the very top of society. Thanks to industrialization, we're also seeing a large growth in the working class of skilled workers who are moving up in society, who are making better wages, who are living in better conditions, whose children don't have to work because the husband or the man or the head of the household makes a lot of money. But we're also seeing a tremendous number of unskilled workers at the very bottom of our society who are sort of trapped in the system of working these really hard, terrible jobs for very long hours and for very, very little pay, putting them in the worst of conditions, both at work and also at home. And it's not a very fair system, and it's only going to get, in some regards, worse and worse and worse. So this is kind of what capitalism has created, right? So if we look around our Industrial Revolution, we might want to ask the question, how can we change it? How can we make things better? How can we keep the positives of industrialization and maybe get rid of some of the negatives of industrialization? Well, one way would be for the government to do something, for the government to step in and begin to set some standards and begin to regulate things and begin to pass laws, taking these businesses a little bit more seriously and put them under the control of the law, to get involved and to clean up the cities and to do those things. And they will do a lot of those things. But government reform and change takes a lot of time. Especially if we want to talk about putting some controls and regulations on the business owners. Business owners are wealthy. They're influential people. Their factories employ thousands of people potentially in a town, and that gives them power. That gives them a strong voice in what happens in that government. So in the United States, somebody like Andrew Carnegie, who, if he opened up a steel mill in your town, could totally transform your town and employ thousands of people and bring millions of dollars into your community, that's somebody that you're going to probably say yes to, somebody you're probably not going to want to offend or bother, so that he'll bring his business to your city. So business owners had a lot of power and influence over politicians, especially on the local level. And they had a lot of control over what happened in those cities. So changing the government at the local level was kind of hard to do because there was a lot of corruption and there was a lot of influence by these business owners. Another way that workers tried to improve their conditions was to do it on their own. If nobody's going to come and do it for us, then we're going to have to take actions into our own hands. And workers in these factories and industries began to form labor unions. So a union is a group of workers that come together to work towards a common goal, most of which being better conditions for themselves, better hours, so shorter hours, of course, right? So we don't want to work 12 hours a day. We'd like to work maybe 8 or 9 hours a day. Better wages. We don't want to work for $1 a day. We would like to get a good wage, maybe $4 or $5 a day. We want to see improvements in the factory. We want to see safety precautions put in place. We want to see a little bit more time to sit down and work, or maybe a break every couple of hours, right? Nothing so outrageous that the owners couldn't afford to do any of those things. So labor unions started to form. We're not going to go into the very, very long history of labor unions, but it wasn't always pretty and it didn't always go very well. But workers are slowly but surely going to come together to try to negotiate with the owners, to sit down and say, hey, these are the things that we would like to see. What are some things you can do to help us maybe reach those goals? Now, the owners are going to be very, very resistant to labor unions because making them work shorter hours or giving them more money is going to hurt their profits. So a lot of owners weren't interested in labor unions in their factories and would fire people who joined labor unions and would do their very, very, very best to prevent unions from developing in their factories. So it's going to be a very, very long struggle for labor unions. One tool that unions could use against the owners was to go on strike, which is where workers refuse to go to work and they go to the factory usually and stand outside the factory and protest their conditions and go on strike and shut the factory down. Strikes became very, very, very common in many factories and many industries because the conditions were so bad. But they generally weren't always very successful, and oftentimes they ended in a lot of violence as the workers and the owners would clash. The owners would bring in security and police forces. They would bring in scab or replacement workers to keep the factory running. And oftentimes the workers were labeled as the bad guys, as troublemakers, right? They're just trying to get some better wages and some better hours for themselves and their families. And it's going to take a very, 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 very long time for unions to really start to get the things that they're looking for. So change is not going to happen very fast, and that becomes very, very, very frustrating. So if capitalism isn't working, if the system is unfair and unjust, if the system is slow to change, is there a better system out there? And this guy is going to say, yes, there is a better system out there, and it's going to happen at some point. And this gentleman's name is Karl Marx. You may have heard of him before. So Karl Marx is going to come up with the idea of socialism, and he's going to write about how socialism will emerge in the world and why it's going to emerge and what's going to happen after it emerges. So let's learn just a little bit about Karl Marx and put him into some historical context. He was born in 1818 in Prussia, which is what Germany will turn into very shortly. And so he's born in the sort of the first part of that first phase of the Industrial Revolution. Things are really starting to progress when he's born. So as he grows up, he's growing up in this newly industrialized age, and he begins to see firsthand the impact of the Industrial Revolution. He sees the living conditions, he sees the working conditions, he sees the unions fighting for representation and for rights in their factories. So he sees all of these things as he grows up, and he's really, truly outraged by the treatment of the working class. And understands that the working class is suffering at the hands of these wealthy business owners. He's going to partner up with a friend of his named Friedrich Engels, and together they're going to write a lot of stuff, drawing attention to the struggles of the working class and criticizing the system that's in place in most countries that have begun to industrialize. And in 1848, they're going to write together a book known as the Communist Manifesto, a very influential, highly influential book in world history. So what exactly is in the Communist Manifesto, and what is Marx talking about? Well, he looks at history as a struggle between those people who are the haves and those people who he considers to be the have-nots. And he says from his book, quote, "History of all societies as the history of class struggle." So as times change, the names may change, right? We might have the nobles and the peasants, like we talked about in the French Revolution. But no matter who they are, where they are in the world, there's always a group of people who are the haves, who want to maintain what they have, and a group who are the have-nots, who want to get the things that the haves have. And the haves want to stop the have-nots, right? So according to Marx, the haves now in our industrial society is a group that he calls the bourgeoisie. That's a term we talked about in the French Revolution. Those would be our wealthy business owners, right? The bourgeoisie. The have-nots he is going to label as the proletariat. These are the working class. This is the average people. These are the people working in the factories that don't have the money, the wealth, and any of the power. So the haves, the business owners, the bourgeoisie, they have the wealth, they have the power, they have the nice houses and the fancy clothes and all this and that. Well, the have-nots really don't have anything at all. They have no money, no wealth, no power, no influence, and they don't have really much at all, really. So they are definitely the have-nots. And this is a really interesting political cartoon that kind of illustrates the point that Marx is trying to make here. We have the wealthy business owners who are always going to keep wages low to maximize their profits. That's what they're going to do. They're always going to pay their workers as low as they possibly can so that they can make as much money as they possibly can. That's the free market capitalist system. Marx says that if this continues, and it certainly will continue, that society will become more and more and more unequal as fewer and fewer people gain access to that wealth, and more and more people work on the bottom of this system that's completely unbalanced. And according to Marx, capitalism was doomed to fail, that this system of inequality, this unequal system, was going to lead to what he called the revolution of the proletariat, that the working class would eventually rise up and they would have a revolution because of the inequity of the system that they were a part of, that this was the only way that they could change things was to lead this revolution of the proletariat. So to break down this cartoon here, this is an American political cartoon about the Pullman Company, which made railroad cars. And we see Mr. Pullman here, George Pullman, dressed in his top hat and suit, which is typically how business owners were drawn, kind of like the Monopoly guy. And he is squeezing his employees. And you can see the money is actually sort of coming out of him as Pullman, who has this little smirky smile on his face, squeezes him down. Long story short, Pullman was very famous for low wages for his workers. He also built a company town where his workers lived. So he was not only their boss, he was also their landlord. So he would pay them really, really low wages and then turn around and charge them really high rent to live in his little company town, which was a very easy way to get his money back. We see some other words written here: capitalism, obviously, monopoly, and wage slavery. So he's paying his workers so low, they're sort of slaves to these low wages. And I think it's pretty clear what's going on here in this image, squeezing these workers to death, really. And that's what a lot of workers felt and experienced under this system, that they were always under the control of the owners. And that's what Marx sees. And he says to them, to the working class, the proletarians have nothing to lose but their chains. They have a world to win. Workers of the world unite. That's the last line of the Communist Manifesto, sort of calling people to go and change the world, that you've got nothing to lose. You are at the very bottom of this society. You are poor. You're being taken advantage of. You have nothing to lose but your chains. Break those chains of this working class and go change the world and get the things that you deserve to have. So what happens now if there is this revolution? What actually would happen? To very simply look at it, this revolution would take place, and then the workers would then sort of rise up and seize control of the factories and the means of production. So the workers would rise up against those owners. They would seize the businesses for themselves. And then the sort of government would step in, and the government would begin to manage and control these businesses and begin to redistribute the wealth. So, the factories will continue to work. The people will continue to work in the factories. But it will come under the control and the ownership, essentially, of the government. And the government would run the factories in the best interest of the people and would begin to redistribute the wealth so that the workers of those factories would begin to be paid more. They would be paid an equal share of what they produced. So if the factory made $1 million that day, then ideally, right, in a perfect world, then the workers of that factory who made all those things would begin to share a little bit more in that profit. So the government would manage and control and sustain these businesses to redistribute the wealth. And then over time, as we begin to redistribute this wealth, then things would start to break down. There wouldn't be a rich anymore, or there wouldn't be a poor class or a rich class anymore. Everybody would kind of meet in the middle. And eventually, Marx says, all social classes would be abolished, and that the government would actually wither away. We wouldn't really need the government anymore because things would be equal. Things would be better. Things would be shared equally amongst the workers, and everybody would essentially be a worker, right? So this sounds pretty awesome, and Marx says this is the way it's going to go, and eventually, at some point, this final stage of socialism would actually lead us into a communist state. Okay, so this is where Marx says we will eventually end up, that at some point, according to his theory, we would all end up at this last stage of communism. And in a communist system, then the government goes away and the workers would then become the owners of the factors of production. The workers would own and control everything. There would be no government, or wouldn't need to be a government, right? Everybody would have everything that they needed. People would not need to rob or steal or do anything negative to other people because they would, in a sense, according to Marx, only be hurting themselves. No government, no religion would be needed, as religion divided people into different groups. According to Marx, religion was the opiate of the masses. It was a drug that people took to be controlled. Pretty controversial thing. A lot of people didn't like Marx for that. That eventually, if this continued, there'd be no nations. There would be no boundaries between people. There would be no nation states anymore. And that we would eventually have sort of a worldwide society where everybody was truly equal. and where everybody benefits and where everybody works. Which sounds amazing, right? Sounds very utopian, right? Sort of a perfect world where everybody shares equally in all things, and there's no violence and there's no warfare, and none of those things exist, right? So that, in a very, 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 very short little nutshell, is Marx's theory of communism, right? That we were going to progress through this system. And when working class people read this and hear his ideas, that sounds pretty awesome to them, right? They can definitely relate to the system that he's describing. They're working hard and they're being abused and they're not being paid. And the idea of them rising up seems pretty awesome. So a lot of working class people are going to embrace these socialist ideas. Labor unions and political activists around the world are going to call for more socialist change. Labor unions are going to, be connecting pretty strongly to these ideas, that the workers have more rights and the workers have more power. And this becomes pretty scary to the government, because socialism is saying eventually the government's not going to be necessary. So they're kind of worried about people sort of taking over at some point. But socialism became pretty popular in the United States and other places, more so in Europe than in America. But America actually did have a socialist party with Eugene V. Debs running for president a couple of times. But in here on the ballot or the poster you can see in 1912. And in the cartoon to the right, if you don't like the system, then vote for somebody who has a plan. Upton Sinclair, who's a famous writer in the United States, ran as a socialist in California. So again, talking about people who the idea of socialism and communism seemed, to working class, a really positive thing, that they can make lots of changes for the better. So again, according to Marx, we're going to progress through a system where capitalism is going to start. It's kind of the natural way things start, where the individual owns the factors of production and that wealth is distributed unequally. There's inequality in that system. He says that can't sustain itself forever, so eventually we're going to move into a socialist structure where the workers, through the government owns the factors of production. They're going to redistribute the wealth and divide it more equally amongst the people. And that through that system, that'll lead us into communism, where everybody essentially owns the factors of production. There's no need for money. There's no need for government. There's no need for anything, because everybody's equal and everybody has everything that they want. So let's talk about some takeaways here. So if we go all the way back to the beginning of this lesson, laissez-faire capitalism is what's introduced by Adam Smith. And this free market capitalist system is going to help make awesome things during our Industrial Revolution, but they're also going to contribute to some significant problems like living and working conditions and this unequal distribution of wealth that's beginning to happen. Karl Marx is going to develop a theory of socialism that explains how society will change due to all this inequality caused by industrialization, that the proletariat, who are the working class people, will rise up in revolution against the bourgeoisie, who are the wealthy business owners. In socialism, the government would own the factors of production and would control the economy and would redistribute the wealth to people. And that Marx theorized that socialism would eventually lead to communism, which is where the workers would own the factors of production, and that the government would wither away and there would be no more need for them at all, as all things would be equal, fair, and everybody would be super happy. Socialist and communist revolutions are going to take place in a couple of different nations, from Russia to China to Vietnam and Cuba. None of those countries will ever be truly socialist, or will definitely never truly be communist, even though they call themselves communist. And that democratic socialism here in the United States, currently in 2021, is a blend of capitalism and socialism that's working to try to create a more balanced society. So, there you have it. That wraps up this video lesson. That was a lot of content. Hopefully you were able to keep up, and hopefully you answered those questions correctly.